So, Netflix has dropped their latest reality check inside America's Next Top Model. And everyone's been watching because this documentary was supposed to be the expose, the behind the scenes of what really happened for the success of the show. But although we got to sit down with Tyra Banks, was this really an expose, or did it further just shine a light on the fact that there's very little accountability within the patriarchal systems? Just profit. Let's talk about it. Okay, so I watched the 3-part documentary reality check inside America's Next Top Model. And I have a few thoughts because what was supposed to be a behind the scenes expose, in my opinion, ends up being a softball interview with Tyra Banks. And though she's in a trench coat, she's doing no true investigative journalism. She's giving us nothing but excuses. And even though we have a cameo from Miss J. Manuel, and of course, Nigel Barker, the 3 OGs of the show's inception and potentially responsible for much of its earlier success, very few are holding themselves accountable for essentially ruining the lives of young women. They're blaming it all on the times because, so much has changed from 2002 to 2026, right? No. And I have notes. The first episode breaks down the inception of America's Top Model, where we learn that this entire creation concept and even the boots on the ground pitching was done by Queen Tyra Banks, supermodel extraordinaire who was already prominent and successful from her fame in the 90s. She wants to have a modeling reality television show in the age of Survivor. So she whomps for about 10 minutes about how she really had to fight blood, sweat, and tears for this concept to get greenlit, and gets greenlit no other place but UPN. It's not necessarily NBC, but she took what she could get. At the time, there was a female president, and the two were in cahoots. She tapped in for additional production chops. Ken Mock was known at the time for his success with Making the Band. The two of them conceived to make the show more of a competition reality show. So that included a casting call, judges, a panel, housing them all together in one space because that's what reality TV likes. They had to thicken the plot. They had to make it sweet. And once you start listing all of these characteristics for a show to be successful, off the gate, there's going to be plenty of exploitation because who's doing this, right? Young women that are vulnerable. So, America's Next Top Model ultimately premiered in 2003, and it ran for 24 cycles over 16 years. It's iconic because it was a rating success right off the gate. Tyra decides to bring in her 2 besties from her modeling career, Miss J, who taught her how to runway walk as early as 16 years old, and of course, J. Manuel, which was her early on makeup artist. They have their panel, which is also a suggestion from production head Ken Mock. Everyone loves a competition show and everyone loves a judge show. So they got their panel of judges. They needed a casting call. They set out and threw out a wide casting net where thousands upon thousands of young women took the bait. Of course, it's Tyra Banks in the early 2000s. And she says she's going to make you hot. Even the theme song, you want to be on top. Mind you, I was in college and all this was going down, but I so remember the onset explosion of the show because reality TV was huge at the time. It was just getting its sea legs, and anything that, again, pitted people against one another, we were pretty much tuned in. Now, I personally didn't last past Eva's season. I think maybe I did one more with Takara. I really can't be sure because it was not my ministry, as I mentioned again. I was much more of an American Idol girl at the time. But I remember the show was very, very successful. Even the concept alone, you do a casting call, cattle call out for women that on the cornerstone, they want to be viewed as beautiful or want to be seen as beautiful. And if you work really hard amongst challenges and pit them against one another, at the end, there will be crowned one champion and that woman will be catapulted into supermodel success, just in the vein as the show's creator and on-air talent, Tyra Banks. I've seen all types of rumors that Keenyah was also involved, but he's nowhere to be found in this documentary. Just whispers of him on the Twitter, whispers of him on the threads. Would love to get some more research to know what happened to Keenyah, why he's not doing interviews, and does he get equal production rights Tyra loves to say in this documentary that this was going to be her one opportunity to leave her lasting mark on the modeling industry by, catch this creative jargon, by taking the young women under her wing, mentoring them, and then ultimately changing the modeling industry by putting forth new images that we haven't really seen before. You know, diversity, thicker models, models of different sizes, models of different ethnicities. Because that's really what we're all about, right? Diversity was the thing that was selling at the time. Well, anywho, that's what Tyra led with. That was her theme that she championed and what she continued to repeat throughout the first 3 to 4 seasons of the show. This was supposed to be her baby, her imprint of making serious change in the modeling industry. We all know what happened. High level, they had immediate success from season 1, cycle 1. It just exploded. And she found success until the show hit its peak and then started to plummet. What we did not see Tyra taking full ownership of the production that was going on in the show. So she starts off leading with, I was the creative head, I was the executive producer, and the tab underneath her speaking, her narration tab absolutely says executive producer of America's Next Top Model. But she and Ken continued to push responsibility and the accountability for all of the ways that America's Next Top Model failed these young women. So young women that were coming out to these casting calls knew who Tyra Banks was. So they were leaning off the strength of supermodel Tyra Banks has a supermodel show where she's going to make other young women supermodels. The promise was always going to be, I'm going to give you a chance to change your life through modeling. Stick with me, Tyra. Fast forward to 2026 when this documentary debuts and she's showing up in a trench coat, absolving all responsibility for ruining anyone's life. Okay? The reality was that she was genuinely exploiting these young women's insecurities for profit. Let's be very clear about that. She knew what the name of the game was. She knew what was at stake because she knew how important it was for the television show to be successful in order to stay at the top of the ratings and in order to generate dollars. Okay, this was a business from the beginning. And this essentially is the plight of the hot girl framework. You've got to figure out the systems that are willing to exploit Black women's bodies in particular in order to gain a profit. And in this particular instance, it wasn't all Black women, but they were all women. And they were all extremely vulnerable. The show taught women off the gate to value their appearance and to pay more attention to what the producers and the panelists had to say above anything else, because that is what would make them successful. Speaking of panelists, the show was super successful in the early seasons based on the personalities of J. Manuel, who was Tyra Banks' makeup artist from her early modeling career, Miss J, who taught Tyra how to walk along with other supermodels, taught them their runway walk. They've been friends since Tyra was 16. And then eventually they brought on Nigel Barker because higher up in production claims that they needed a straight white man in order to balance out the 2 gay men that were seated along Tyra Banks. They also later brought in Janice Dickinson, a white supermodel, in order to round out the panel cast. And that's kind of, if you ask my opinion, when things got a little murky because, I mean, what's worse than having 3 people giving you their honest opinion about how you look than having 4 to 5? That's exactly what young women need to boost their self-esteem. So here's what we also learned in the documentary that is the most riveting. And I feel like a lot of people are taking this portion of the expose and thinking that we're getting the truth. And we are getting aspects of the truth, but not the whole truth. Because again, for a show to run for this many cycles and have a 3-part docuseries, they took a small amount of models and utilized them for this documentary. Now, the 3 that stood out that everyone's talking about are Shandi Sullivan from Cycle 2, who blacked out during her production cycle after a trip to Milan when the models were there and were served alcohol, encouraged to drink until they couldn't drink anymore. But they also invited men over, male models, and Shandi ended up having sex without consent. And the whole time it was being recorded. So it's very clearly a case of sexual assault, because if you're blackout drunk, it is impossible for you to consent. And again, sex without any consent is assault. Be very clear about that. It is disgusting that we had to look back on this and see that allegedly, Tyra Banks not only knew about this production misstep, but was privy to its creation, knew about it when it was going down in real time. No one, including she nor Ken, stepped in to stop the recording or the sexual encounter. They had no issue with trying to air it thereafter. And in fact, as the story progressed and Shandi had to not only break up with her boyfriend, call the local clinic to check on her STDs, and then ultimately grilled by Tyra Banks and her fellow models, production cameras continued to roll. All mortifying from any way you want to try to stretch that. There was no way you could absolve accountability in that regard. Tyra buttoned up her trench coat and said directly to the camera, I don't even really know who Shandi is. Shandi. The lies. Because if you fast forward several years, Tyra Banks had an American's Next Top Model reunion on her now defunct talk show, where she brought Shandi back on again and drilled down for the third time, trying to make her feel guilty about the mishap on the show. And by mishap, I mean sexual assault at the hands of good old Tyra Banks. Just disgusting. It's really deplorable. The episode at the time aired as The Girl Who Cheated, and they ended up making Shandi's real life trauma into a storyline. In spite of her asking to leave, in spite of her asking not to be recorded, Ken Mott kept the cameras rolling. And then it came out, it was revealed in this documentary episode that the only reason that the audience didn't see more of the sexual assault was because a few days before was the Super Bowl instance where Janet and Justin Timberlake were performing, and Justin ripped off Janet's brassiere, exposing her left teat. And so everyone in media was concerned about the censorship aspects of all of their upcoming reality shows and live television. I don't care whose teats were shown. Everyone can tell that sexual assault was wrong, whether it be 2006 or 2026. There's really not much to be confused about or misaligned there, honestly. We also heard from Keenyah Hill from Cycle 4, and she reported, we saw this on the show, but then she detailed again 20 years later, that she was increasingly uncomfortable on set while shooting with male models in Africa. And a male model was touching her inappropriately. In spite of her protesting on set, in spite of her speaking up in the judges panel, she was still kicked off the show and reprimanded for actually speaking out as opposed to supported. And we all know as women, that's the only thing that is acceptable in any of these instances. No means no. You don't have to subjugate yourself to improper touching or anybody feeling on you inappropriately. Miss J and J Manuel were passing it along to, oh, that was production. We didn't really have a lot to do with that. That was production. And then the camera would flash to them actually reprimanding Keenyah in real time, telling her to suck it up. That's just the industry. Deplorable. And then we also heard from Danielle Evans, who was a Cycle 6 winner, right? Danny was the model, black model, who Tyra encouraged to close her gap. In fact, she even physically made her close the gap as little, well, shorten the gap, because Danny refused and ultimately won. Amongst other women that were shown from that same cycle, undergoing all types of dental trauma at the hands of looking better for the judges and for their modeling career. After Danny won that cycle, however, she was blacklisted in New York from the couture modeling scene. And when she finally got an opportunity to talk to Tyra about it, Tyra allegedly reasoned with her and said, hey girl, I knew that was gonna happen. And I probably could have stepped in and intervened to help your career soar as she had promised, but I didn't. My bad. My bad? What? Deplorable. Ugh. Tyra encouraged another contestant in the cycle after her, a white woman, to actually widen her tooth gap. The irony, how people will play in your face in patriarchal settings. Anything to get attention and to get more profit. Same feature, two different women. And what was most disgusting of all is Tyra, a fellow black woman, we just knew was going to help support her other black models based on the premise of her whole ideology behind the show. Tyra was a bit more interested in helping those young ladies succeed. She was definitely more interested about keeping those ratings high and keeping the viewers interested. That was clearly her bottom line. Where have we seen this before? In patriarchal pimping? It's the systems, baby. Tyra did what patriarchy always does, taking her own experiences of exploitation. She loves to reference them. Let's be very clear. Tyra wrote a book about how in Tyra's earlier days of modeling, that she allegedly wasn't treated the kindest, the fairest. She had her own struggles with being accepted within the industry by modeling agents and other models. And instead of really leaning in on that and being healed from that trauma, it looks like Tyra turned it on its head and started traumatizing these young women, these vulnerable young women that came on her show. Instead of genuinely providing them mentorship, she instead critiqued them to their demise, just ruined their self-esteem, aspects of their physical beauty, and again, did not give them the payment that they assumed they were going to get. There were so many models that came through to say, America's Next Top Model didn't do anything for me. I didn't get any money. I had to get it out the mud. Yikes. Wasn't that the whole premise of the show? So instead of dismantling the patriarchal systems that kept her oppressed, her being Tyra Banks, she ended up being a recruiter, just like a pimp. Because at the time, it was a way for her to make more money than she had access to before. And if she could make more and hurt some people along the way, so be it. Anything to make sure that she was no longer being victimized in the same way that she was. But just as Audre Lorde says, you cannot dismantle the master's house by using the master's tools. Message. So here's why I call Tyra Banks a pimp, and she's another star in our Pimp Chronicle. Pimp is being used in the academic sense, let's be very clear. And the way my plot of the hot girl framework would define a pimp is essentially the ways in which they work within the patriarchal systems to act as recruiters and profiteers off the vulnerable. So Tyra worked to recruit vulnerable women at the hands of a larger system, the network. She was just doing whatever the network needed her to do in order to keep that check coming in. Recruited vulnerable women. They were young, inexperienced, and most of them, quite often, if you peel back the onion, they were coming from very, very fragile situation, fragile home lives, poor economic backgrounds, just a genuine desperation to get out and make it. And they looked at this show as an opportunity, their one shot to do so. Tyra knew that. The producers knew that. In fact, they capitalized on that. As the show's cycles kept growing and gaining in popularity, their casting calls became wider, more extravagant, and the competition stakes became higher. Something that's also interesting to note is that the modeling industry, as we know now and have done the research and are still doing the research with links to the Epstein files, Victoria's Secret, is this not a couple of steps away from sex work? So models in general don't make a whole heap of money. Not everybody's going to be Naomi Campbell, right? So if you take that into consideration, think about how as these casting calls are widespread and not even everyone makes it on the show, think about all the poachers that are around in the cities, on the internet, calling telephones and having their own one-off casting calls in order to recruit young, beautiful, vulnerable women, take their photographs. And none of them ever ended up on magazine covers. So where do you think that their photos ended up? What do you think they ended up doing? How do you think they were preyed upon based on the model that we saw, the large and more lucrative model that was America's Next Top Model? Okay? The micro to the macro. Got to think about it. The show also promised a transformation. Did it truly transform all of those women? Some would argue, yes, there was some physical transformation if you were lucky to make it to the finals. Was it for their better? This is where it gets very, very interesting. Pull from your own account, but I would suggest that the majority of these physical transformations were not from the better. Young women even on this documentary were discussing their eating disorders, their lack of self-esteem, how it took a nosedive after the show, during the show. Desire to stay in the modeling industry was taken away because of some of the hurtful comments from the panelists and the judges, and just the entire environment was just not conducive to empowering young women at the time, no matter their size or their skin color. And then they controlled their image. So the young, vulnerable women who now have been promised transformation, desperate, possibly lied to about getting access and gaining more money, they're now having their images controlled, narrative control, which is a key key characteristic in patriarchy by the show's programming, the show's production, and the show's ad agencies. So all of these women, their images were used on billboards for ads, plastered on the internet for show promotion, utilized to recruit other young women for new cycles. The women were told what to do, what to wear, how they were going to look. And if they did not comply, they were told that they could not continue on in the competition. Sounds like complete control to me. Everyone profited from this women's labor, even if they never made it to the final round. The contestants never got any residuals from the show, although it was shown all over the world. There was never any back end and never any ownership. The only ones that got the ownership, the back end, and the royalties, you guessed it, Tyra Banks, I'm assuming Ken Mock, and of course the networks of which they were housed, like UPN. It's also interesting to note that in this show's instance, the mentorship that was promised was ultimately weaponized against the women. We saw this in one of the most viral clips where Tyra weaponized her mentorship against this young woman who tried to quit after failing to properly read one of these narrative in the competitions. And she famously screams, "I was rooting for you. We were all rooting for you." They were punishing any type of resistance, however. Should you choose to walk off, or should you choose to tell the judges or Tyra you were uninterested? Well, you gotta go. They had no tolerance for that foolishness. And anytime you question that or question the process, you were eliminated or villainized. Peace pipe, crack pipe. The gag, though, is Tyra was never on top of the pyramid. The advertisers, network executives, and in particular, the heads of all of these networks were the ultimate ones in control. They were the ones that ultimately profited the most from all this exploitation. And though Tyra was able to walk away with allegedly over $38 million from the show's success, and we don't even know what her royalty numbers look like because the show was spun off in different countries and different iterations of the show that she created, the companies that made the most, again, were the network heads based on the advertisement, the royalties, and the original rights to all of the show and all of the images of the women and the young ladies that were funneled through each of these cycles. That's pimping. That is patriarchal exploitation. This is the way that these patriarchal systems survive, okay? They find the women that have made it. They need a face. This one was Tyra Banks. You need a face that's gonna sell it, a face that's gonna recruit. How else are you going to get these young women to buy into it unless you've got someone who's already done it and looks beautiful, she fits the bill, and then sells you an illusion that you can do it too? What I will say that is different from a lot of commentary that I'm seeing are that these young ladies that participated were not completely blindsided. Like, they absolutely have a level of agency. So I'll give you cycle 1 to 2, perhaps. You didn't really know what you were walking into because reality television was still relatively new, especially in the competition space, right? But once we start getting into cycle 5, 6, 7, and 17, you're pretty much aware that you're going to be falling victim in some aspect to the possible foolery that is America's Next Top Model. Because at this point, you're having women come out and say things like, #1 cycle winner, I think her name is Adrienne Curry, who won from the very beginning. She had already been all over the news at that time by the time her cycle had ended, and we were up to cycle 4 or 5, screaming and hollering about how Tyra Banks never gave her $100,000, and that's why she ended up being on the reality show circuit. Y'all remember when she married that guy from the Brady Bunch? And that's how she started developing her whole reality TV stardom outside of America's Next Top Model. So some of these women did go on to have decent careers outside of the show, but it took their own grit. It took their own might. We saw a number of young models that were successful. And the documentary did not interview all of the models from the cycles, particularly Ava, the diva. She's one of my favorites, who's now a successful, prominent actress and another reality television star who doesn't speak negatively about Tyra Banks, believe it or not. She actually credits Tyra for laying the foundation, kicking in the door as a television show that gives women an opportunity. In Eva's instance, she takes the show for what it was at the time and gives it full credit and takes accountability for the fact that she was a participant in a reality show, knowing full well what she was getting into, and used her own grittiness, if you will, in the entertainment industry in order to forge her own path and create her own career. All of the 4 stars that were mentioned on the show, including Ken Mock, who acted like he had no idea what was going on half the time, which I thought was disgusting. Everyone continued to pass the buck throughout this documentary. We did note that as of recently, well, in the last year, Miss J suffered a stroke and is now struggling to walk again. But outside of that touching moment and learning that the 3 panelists, Miss J, J. Manuel, and Nigel Barker, are still friends and remain close, nobody talks to Tyra. Tyra doesn't talk to anyone. Surprise, 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 surprise. Yeah, she's done with y'all. She was done with you all after she fired you all and made sure that she continued to get a check. But that's patriarchy too. That's pimping. Because if she could do it to other people, why would you feel like she would not absolve you and that your friendship would be what? Something that she would stick around for? That's not Tyra. That's not patriarchal capitalism, baby. It's not how it works. So, I mean, there's a little bit of empathy that I felt watching the show, especially at the end when Miss J was discussing the stroke and the panel of friends came together. I mean, I shed a little tear. But outside of that, no one's really taking real accountability for ruining some of these young women's lives, or the fact that, you all had millions of dollars at your fingertips and what you chose to do with it, that's on you. Like Jay Manuel was womping about the fact that he almost got fired while he was vacationing in St. Lucia. Okay, girl. Miss J served 15 years in SCAD and was working with couture models still before the stroke. Okay, girl. You all still managed to have prominent careers. Just what are you doing now? I can't speak to your GoFundMe situations. That sounds like a problem that's above my pay grade. Because if you had access to millions at one time, I'm not sure what happened. That might be another documentary that we may want to see. So Netflix has this show ranked in the top 10, even now, a week later. And the same corporate media ecosystem that profited back in the early 2000s from America's Next Top Model being a popular show and series is the same media ecosystem that's profiting now. And now the buck is being passed to another entity, Netflix. Netflix, the juggernaut, I'm pretty positive, made sure that Tyra, J, Miss J, and Nigel got a little check for sitting down and talking, because we never hear from Tyra unless it involves some self-aggrandization or a dollar. Let's be real. It's Tyra Banks. She was fooling nobody in that trench coat. Definitely not me. Ugh. And the Lord don't like ugly. It's starting to show all through her aura because of the way she was treating people. This is my assumption. Doesn't fare well on the skin. Doesn't fare well with your hair and makeup stylist. Girl, blink twice. Tyra Banks is currently in court fighting a landlord over her failed Schmize and Dream ice cream business. I know she's out in Australia doing that like hot ice cream. Child. Shandi's pain has been monetized on the show's replay, on this documentaries, on the talk show circuits. I mean, it's just repeated over and over and over again, but someone's getting a check. Got to think about that. There's also another documentary that's supposed to come out on the E! Network in the middle of March. So this will potentially be a part 2. So we can really get more in depth, hopefully from Janice Dickinson's lens, about the patriarchal rule, the behind the scenes expose and degradation of those vulnerable victims that were models in the show. The T is that allegedly Tyra was a tyrant to work with. After this docuseries, I can imagine that. Again, the hot girl is always the product, as we've discussed many a times in my Plight of the Hot Girl framework. The young women at the bottom of the totem pole getting exploited, they're usually the most vulnerable, and the higher ups above the patriarchal pyramid, they profit the most. Tyra found herself right in the middle. And the saddest thing is, in spite of knowing how these girls were being vulnerable and exploited, she did very little to stop it. She's more concerned with the profit, maintaining her position, and keeping her patriarchal paychecks. She wanted to keep them happy and satisfied. And that meant recruiting more, doing more, behaving badly. Are we even going to speak to the fact that they had to do an ethnicity blackface challenge? That's when I had definitely stopped watching. But then they said that she had done it again. Like 10 cycles later, she was told to stop. Like, hold up, girl, you might be crossing the line. And Tyra was like, you're right. Only to bring it back seasons later. Have we learned nothing? And in fact, I know I'm answering my own question. I know we've learned nothing because Tyra looks in the camera at the end of this 3-part docuseries and says, but wait till you see what we have next for cycle 25. Girl, don't nobody want that cycle. We just want the expose. I'm not going to give you the easy pass like Sherry Shepherd. What the hell is that? Like to say something as ignorant as the times were so much different back then. Exploitation is exploitation, pimping is pimping. What I will say is that social media was not nearly as dogmatic and hell-bent on bringing people down as we are today. And now we can look at things with a more critical lens, and rightfully so, because what is wrong with challenging the patriarchal systems that keep us entertained, keep us dumbed down in the midst of real abuse, sex work, sex trafficking, sexual assault. We even saw those on the show in real time. And just as Audre Lorde told us that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So in this instance, this Netflix documentary was another tool of the master. So it didn't really dismantle anything, if you ask me. It was quite honestly a softball pitch to go back and watch more of this television. Ultimately, as we continue to break down these frameworks, the process looks very familiar, easily repeatable, always profitable. That is the plight of the hot girl. This is what we as Black women have to struggle to face and survive every day in different levels, from different industries. We survive by conforming, and we thrive by confronting, by challenging these systems. We have the opportunity to not enforce this same patriarchal foolery on a new generation by challenging these systems and truly doing the work to dismantle them, questioning and then looking within ourselves to learn what would it be about myself or my fellow homegirl that would make her self-esteem be so low to question that she needs to go into a reality television show and stay, although she's being exploited. So if you've ever felt like you weren't pretty enough, thin enough, smart enough, famous enough, you don't have enough likes, all of these are tools that are designed from the system to keep you buying products, chasing ridiculous standards of beauty, chipping away at your self-esteem, to keep you feeling inadequate. The antidote is community and self-love, and women that are intentional about loving themselves and our communities better so that we can break this cycle of centering patriarchal bullshit. So of course, I'm going to be back to talk about this documentary part 2 when it drops on E. But in the meantime, I want to know, did you watch? What did you think? Let me know in the comments below, because again, this is a safe space for real talk, and pimping is real and we got to stop it. Remember to like and subscribe to this video and stay tuned for more. Let me know what you want to see. And always remember that you deserve